have been changed in many manuscripts because Jesus must be omniscient to be God. Ehrman's literal translation of this verse indicates that no one but God knows the hour, not 42. Development of the Christian doctrine: even the angels of heaven nor even the Son, but the Father alone. Ibid. p. 204. As we see above, the King James Version omits direct reference to the Son, as do several other versions. Another divine quality is the ability to assign the souls their positions in the hereafter. Jesus tells us that only God can do this. When he speaks to his disciples James and John and their mother, she asks him to promise that her sons will be on either side of him in the hereafter. He said to them, "You will indeed drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left, this is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." Matthew 20:23, New Revised Standard Version. Surely, when Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, didn't he demonstrate that he was neither omnipotent nor omniscient? "Father, if you are willing, take this cup away from me, still, not my will but yours be done." Luke 22:42, New American Bible. Jesus made it clear in many ways that he was not God, that God is greater. Nowhere is this more definitely stated than when he spoke to his disciples about his imminent departure. "If you loved me, you would rejoice that I am going to the Father, because the Father is greater than I." John 14:28, New Revised Standard Version. Furthermore, just a few verses later in 14:31 he stated that he did as the Father has commanded me. Are Jesus and God one and the same? 43 Jesus's prayer as demonstrated above, and throughout the Gospels, Jesus prayed to God. This certainly argues against his being God. Would God pray to himself? Like Luke 22:42, the Gospel of Matthew reports that a very human Jesus became distressed in Gethsemane and turned to God for solace. He advanced a little and fell prostrate in prayer. "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet, not as I will, but as you will." Matthew 26:39, New American Bible. Mark reports that right before he was betrayed Jesus was in anguish and feeling the need to pray, requesting his disciples to keep watch. He prayed 3 times, each time returning to find his disciples sleeping. Then he said to them, "My soul is sorrowful even to death. Remain here and keep watch." He advanced a little and fell to the ground and prayed that if it were possible the hour might pass by him. He said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible to you. Take this cup away from me, but not what I will but what you will." Mark 14:34-6, New American Bible. Jesus also prayed to God that the people might believe in him as God's messenger. It seems this specifically defines the role of Jesus as deliverer of God's message. Jesus looked upwards and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake." 44. Development of the Christian doctrine of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. John 11:41-42, New Revised Standard Version. For many perhaps one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that Jesus was not God is in the way that he taught the disciples to pray. This is reported in Luke 11:1-4 in a shortened form and in Matthew in the form more familiar to most Christians. "After this manner therefore pray ye, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth, as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen." Matthew 6:9-13, King James Version. Note that Jesus taught us to pray to the Father, our Creator, not to himself. In fact, he did not mention himself in any way, nor did he indicate that we should pray in his name. His instructions were very specific. We are to pray to God alone. Would this be the case if Jesus himself were God? Reported dying words even in the narration of his death. In the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, there is an incident that to some contradicts the concept of Jesus's divinity. According to these two references, Jesus was put on the cross and left to die. Then, as Mark reports it, are Jesus and God one and the same? 45 At 3 o'clock Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Mark 15:34. New Revised Standard Version. Is it logical that God would ever say, my God, why have you forsaken me? This utterance was recorded in both Gospels in Jesus's mother tongue, Hebrew Aramaic, thus emphasizing the accuracy of transmission. More recently it has been pointed out that these dying words are the beginning words of Psalm 22, a psalm addressing God, not words spoken by God. The psalmist here calls himself a worm, and implores for God's help. Upon you I was thrust from the womb. Since birth you are my God. Do not stay far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Psalm 22:11-12. New American Bible Scholarly Developments. There has long been a great deal of debate among Christian theologians and scholars regarding the divinity of Jesus. This debate has intensified in recent years, and there seems to be an increasingly open concern over the truth of this doctrine. For example, the authors of The Myth of God Incarnate, the Westminster Press, 1977, p. X, concluded that Jesus was as he is presented in Acts 2:21, a man approved by God, for a special role within the divine purpose, and the later conception of him as God incarnate, the second person of the Holy Trinity living a human life, is a mythological or poetic way of expressing his significance for us. Other Christian scholars have questioned not only the claims that Jesus is God, but even that he publicly proclaimed 46. Development of the Christian doctrine himself to be the Messiah. On October 17, 1987, the Associated Press released the following news release. Street, Paul, Min. App. A group of biblical scholars known as the Jesus Seminar has decided that Jesus did not publicly proclaim himself the Messiah. The scholars say the belief that he did, held by many Christian denominations, was added to biblical texts by early church officials. The group is meeting at Luther Northwestern Seminary in St. Paul this weekend as part of a 5-year effort to reach a consensus on which sayings attributed to Jesus are historically accurate and which were added by others. Individual scholarly efforts to determine the historical nature of the Gospels, and of Jesus himself, are not new. What is unusual about this group is its effort to reach voting consensus, after study and debate. The group includes about 125 Roman Catholic, Protestant and non-Christian scholars. Seminar leaders admit the findings are not to be taken as truth, but rather as a scholarly theory of uncertainty. One example of the biblical phrases that the group claims are not authentic is in John 11:25, where Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will never die. In concluding that Jesus did not make such messianic claims, the group cites non-canonical and highly controversial sources such as the Gospel of Thomas and the hypothetical Q document. Arizona Daily Star, October 18, 1987. Significantly, the Jesus Seminar leaders admitted that their scholarly findings are not to be taken as truth, but rather as a scholarly theory of uncertainty. In other words, even leading scholars are still uncertain. One of the most important outcomes of the 1987 meeting of the Jesus Seminar is that the biblical statements in John 11:25-26 are not authentic. This is relevant to this chapter, since many Christians understand these particular verses to mean that Jesus is God. Are Jesus and God one and the same? 47 Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. John 11:25-26. New American Bible. The opposing view. Examination of verses. We have seen that there is significant scriptural evidence that Jesus was not God. On the other hand, there are numerous other verses understood by many Christians to mean that he was divine. The rest of this chapter examines many of those verses. It seems appropriate at this time to quote from Michael Goulder, staff tutor in theology, Birmingham University. Goulder states in The Myth of God Incarnate Ibid, p. 48, in my early ministry I was still a trembling believer in Chalcedonian orthodoxy. Jesus was God the Son, of one substance with the Father, who came down from heaven. Trembling beliefs do not alter themselves. They are reinforced daily by the repetition of the liturgy. When I look back, I think that the firmest plank on which my creed rested was the familiar passage in John 1, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This was not alone, for there were similar statements in Col 1 and Phil 2, and hints of the same in many of the Pauline letters, and in Hebrews. Where had St. John got the doctrine from? Not from Jesus. In these lines we see some of the biblical references understood by many people to mean that Jesus is God. We also see in the same lines that Goulder found those roundabout statements do not bestow divinity upon Jesus. 48. Development of the Christian doctrine. Since Michael Goulder, at least for a period in his life, was a typical Christian, let us look at the biblical references that led him to believe that Jesus was God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John 1:14. New Revised Standard Version. This verse makes a clear distinction between the Word and the Father.